Yeah, so I saw on your Facebook that you sprained your thumb. I wanted to say something, but then I was like, is Sarah just gonna think I'm being stupid or mean right now? Because I'm like, I don't know if that translates into American English or if we just kind of use it here in South Africa. But what I wanted to say was, we can only dress you and take you nowhere. I don't know if that is like a phrase that you use overseas or in America.
Something similar will say we can't take you anywhere. The dress you part isn't part, but it's similar.
She's just gonna think I'm being weird now. Like, what?
No, I think I just need to stay indoors for a while. This last week has been just minor inconvenience after minor inconvenience. And this story isn't even a fun story. I literally opened a door and the door handle snapped up and sprained a tendon.
How old are you, honestly?
It was on my 42nd birthday. It makes life interesting, I guess. And I got this cool brace. It's shaped specially so that you can still put your hand on the keyboard and type comfortably.
Wow, okay, that is actually pretty nice. I'm trying to think if I had anything eventful happening. Oh, ooh, you know what I did this weekend? So we had a girls' get together, and we decided that we were gonna do embroidery. Have I ever done that in my life? No. But did I have fun? Yes. Am I finished, though, is the question. No, is the answer. Because you don't realize how long it takes to embroider something. Like, I was just like, 3 hours went by and I was like, I did like 5 centimeters.
Now we have to share embroidery projects. I've been embroidering for years.
Oh my gosh, that's interesting. Well, you know what? I think the people who might understand writers the most are people who embroider. Because it takes very long to just do something small and insignificant.
Yes, to do it right, to make it look good. Absolutely. Well, today I wanted to grab it with this hand. I always grab my drink with that hand and I can't. Minor inconveniences. So it's cold and I am drinking hot chocolate.
I feel like someone should be monitoring me for what I'm drinking because I can't remember what tea I picked up last. But so today I'm going to drink cardamom tea. It smells very spicy. Oh, it's actually nice. Oh, didn't expect that one.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay, so are we ready for this episode?
I am so ready.
Hi, hello, let's go. Welcome to Tea and Tales. We are so happy that you're here with us. I'm Madeleine Einau.
And I am Sarah Sampson. We especially want to thank Kurti Ohm and Jenny Dalton. Thank you to everybody for joining us each week. This week we have a special guest. Again, we get to have a nice group of special guests in the next few episodes. And today's special guest is Mattea Orr. She is a horror writer, and she will be helping us to discuss the spice levels of horror.
We did the romance spice levels last week. I didn't even know that horror had a spice level. I'm excited to learn because I don't really know much about horror to begin with.
So please welcome Mattea Orr. Well, Mattea, we are so excited that you are with us today, and I apologize for pronunciating your name wrong in the intro. It is I just did it again. I apologize.
That's okay. Listen, it's been happening to me since before I even was in school.
It should be easy because we're Tea and Tales and it's Mattea.
Mattea. It's got T right in it. There you go.
Now everybody will always remember how to say your name because I am known for messing up names and we fixed it.
You fixed it, exactly.
Before we jump into our topic of the day, I talk a little bit about who you are as an author and how you got into being an author.
I think I got into being an author, I don't know if by default is. I think everybody has I loved reading when I was growing up, and I was, writing Anne of Green Gables fan fiction before fan fiction was kind of a thing, just in a notebook in my room. And I don't think I really got into creative writing seriously until I was in grad school. And we had this wonderful professor who let us, instead of writing a midterm, literary analysis type paper, we got the choice to write a creative short story. In grad school, I was like, desperate for anything that wasn't actual like work. I actually ended up taking 2 classes with her, and so I wrote 2 short stories for midterms, and she was super encouraging and supportive. And I think one of those I actually did go on to get published in an anthology, and that was sort of a time when I was like, it felt so good to write those stories as opposed to the work of creating like the literary analysis and those types of papers, that when I finished grad school, my husband and I had moved to a town that was about an hour away from where our family was. And so we didn't know a lot of people. And to help fill the time, I started writing a novel. But I think that first one took me like 7 years to finish. But I had like 3 kids in the middle. So there was a reason. There were 3 reasons. I was a time travel novel. And if I could give younger me some time travel advice, it would be, don't do that. Time travel is hard. It melts your brain. Once you finish it, you have to edit it. And when you edit a novel, it's a lot of like taking bits apart and making sure it doesn't knock over the dominoes that you've been so careful to set up at other parts. And time travel, it's like 100 times worse. So that would be the advice I'd give to my younger self. And from there, I've written kind of under a speculative umbrella of like, I've written contemporary fantasy and YA romantasy, and I've written mystery in both like adult historical and contemporary YA flavors. And of course, horror has been one that I've dabbled in each time. Each of those short stories I mentioned earlier, those were horror short stories. I just have been really good at scaring myself ever since I was small. I thought I'd share. I don't know. You guys remember those books? They were like Alan Schwartz's like scary stories to tell in the dark and more scary stories to tell in the dark. And you could get them at like less book fair. And even the covers, the cover art was so scary to look at. They were like these black and white sort of ghoulish drawings. They were sort of like a series of short stories, and in them was kind of like what we would think of as like copy pasta today, or urban legends, or sort of like classic ghost stories of, the girl with the ribbon around her neck, and the hitchhiker you pick up that disappears. The one that lives rent free in my head to this day is a girl that had a plant she got somewhere where it must have been a spider in the plant. Oh, trigger warning for spiders for the rest of this little story here. And then a spider lays an egg in her face, and then there are baby spiders. Just see Nell going, nope. She's like, I live in South Africa. Spiders are extra bad here.
Extra bad. No, I think the worst spiders are in Australia. Like, you cannot pay me enough to go there and face a spider. I'm like, thank you. I would rather face a lion over here. Thank you very much.
You're like, at least the lion can't like disappear on you. And you're like, it's somewhere in this room. Yeah.
And you still have quite a few short stories that you've published, and we'll put some of those links down in the show notes for people. But you are also on submission with your horror books with your agent. Who's your agent, and what's your agency, and who's the agency you're with?
So I'm represented by Mara Hollander at Azantian Literary. Shout out to Mara. She's fantastic. Azantian has been amazing. So that's been a wonderful experience. And yes, we're on submission with several books, one of which is a gothic horror. It's dual POV, but it's not split in half. And it's also part historical, part contemporary, kind of a updated take on a classic haunted house story. It focuses on 2 sets of sisters. One is the descendants of the other sisters. The original sisters were founders of spiritualism movement, think seances, think ectoplasm in the dark, that kind of thing. And then their descendants go on to become modern day ghost hunters. There's like a sort of Mobius strip kind of effect between the past and the present, where the 2 sets of sisters are currently occupying the same house, and things get messy and spooky and kind of dark.
I love how you were like, nah, no, time travel is hard. This sounds very, very hard.
No, you're right. I did it to myself again, didn't I? It was like when my agent told me, let's talk about themes when we went to do like the content edit and then developmental edit for that book. And I was like, I don't know, I have this big list of themes. And she was like, I think this theme might be one of themes you've explored in some other books that you've written. And it's like the nature of truth. And I'm like, oh, man, she got me again.
Gosh darn it. I love that. Well, I must admit, like, I'm not a big horror person. So, because, like, the tempo of horror, is it pretty slow?
You know, the tempo of horror is a place where I think authors have just played like a great big toy box lately. I feel like we've had this real resurgence of horror, almost like a horror renaissance, where now you've got people are talking about horror mance, like horror romance kind of a thing.
No!
Yes, and more speculative, like dark fantasy or elements in like mysteries and thrillers and suspense will have a horror element to them where there's a little bit of a speculative thing going on, which before kind of would have just been more in the purview of straight horror genre. So I feel like we're playing all over. Like Gothic horror does tend to be slower. It does tend to be at least start a little quieter. And it's so much more, you know, psychological and things like that. But sometimes you still end up with like, it was like in like Mexican Gothic, I think was one of the books that really helped kick off the resurgence of the Gothic in horror. It's this book where it does start kind of slow, but there's this creeping sense of unease and dread, and you're starting to feel more and more sure. You're just a little bit ahead of the main character, being sure that like something is not right, but you're not totally understanding what it is. But by the end, and no spoilers, but like it gets big and it gets like I don't know if bad is the right word, but it gets very climactic. Like you're no longer feeling like you're in a quiet book.
This is like one of my favorite topics right now because I'm currently trying to write a dark fantasy and I don't read a lot of horror or know a whole lot about it. So I've been learning. I'm just like getting all the tingles. And I almost want to just dive into that book now that you just mentioned. And I feel like a lot of people will confuse thriller and mystery with horror. What sets horror apart from thriller and mystery genre?
Kind of the same way that we've been incorporating more and more romance into different genres, you know, but romance has very strict conventions that you do have to abide by if you're going to actually call it a romance. You know, the biggest, of course, is that happily ever after that everybody wants to get. But for horror, you definitely don't need a happily ever after. And there will be books that fall into either camp. One of the like classic horror conventions is bringing the reader back and oftentimes the main character or characters back into a sense of safety, back into a sense of like the world set right or the world as we know it. But very quickly, I feel like great authors started poking holes in that convention. And I don't think it's one that you like, it's definitely not one you have to abide by anymore. It's like there are different types of horror novels. I think you could have a suspense novel or a thriller that's about serial killers, right? Or true crime. And they're terrifying. They can be scarier than horror because, especially for some people, because you're like, well, this could really happen. But what horror does, I think at its best, is it really takes elements of society and sort of shines a light on them and uses a little bit of exaggeration, or it pushes it into the supernatural so that we get sucked in by the story and the idea and that sense of fear, and then we can kind of use it as a lens to examine elements all around us in the world. There's a lot of horror right now that's coming out from people of color, from LGBTQIA plus writers. Feminist horror is super hot right now. It uses horror as a way to talk about like experiences that groups have had or people have had. Instead of giving a sense of safety and like, here are the confines in which we can discuss this, gives a new way to explain how bad it was or how scary it was or like where we might be headed. I think it does a lot of the work that like dystopian does when dystopian is really firing on all cylinders and doing a great job.
You know that you mentioned different people have different horror level limits, which is definitely a thing. Like, do you have like a -5? Because I think that's where I am at. In the last episode when we talked about the romance spice levels, like what spice level means for me is very different from what it might mean to you. And I think it's the same concept that you can use for horror as well. What I see as being terrifying, someone else might be like, that's mild. There's 5 levels to horror levels, which is also similar to romance, which makes life much easier. Let's go through all the levels that there are and how you would kind of figure out whether like the level would be for you or not.
I tend to be a little bit of a scaredy cat when it's time to like watch a scary movie or a scary show. There are some really good ones. So my husband, who loves horror and has a higher tolerance than I do, he'll be watching with me, and I'll like, tell me when that part's over.
I find it so ironic that you're a horror writer then.
Yeah, me too. Honestly, I know. But I think that when you have a good understanding of what scares you and what might scare other people, it can be really helpful. So when I write, my husband often will beta read for me. And so if I've scared him in my writing, then I know that I have done a good job. And other people with normal tolerance levels will also be scared.
I think it is also because you know what is going to happen. It doesn't scare you that much.
Yeah. That's a big help.
I think it's important for authors to understand all these different levels and what it could mean to somebody else so they can more accurately adjust how they're talking about their own writing. If it's really spooky to you, but you understand it's a level 1, then you can mark it and say, it's got a little kick.
And I think it's true for romance readers too. They get a little bit inured to what's happening on the page in terms of the different levels, like we're talking spice levels or spooky levels. And so I think as readers, they do have a little bit of a responsibility, if they don't want to be disappointed some of the time, to read a review or two, kind of check in and see if that's actually what you want out of your reading experience.
The 5 horror levels resource that I found is from Katie Campbell and Isabel Cañas on their website. And so they start with a level 1 being strange, but not very unsettling, usually lightened up with humor or with romance. What sort of feeling do you have about that low level and how it would manifest in your writing?
Especially like gothic horror, but any kind of horror, a lot of it, like a lot of stories, it's about the vibes that you're creating. If you've worked really hard to create a spooky, tense vibe, the minute that you break that tension with humor, I mean, you are providing a sense of relief to the reader, but you've kind of punctured your bubble of that little like tense moment. Horror is mostly about what's about to happen. Our fear of seeing the terrible thing on page that we're not sure we want to see, but we kind of can't look away. So for me, when I'm writing gothic, that's a lot of maybe somebody misunderstanding their senses, or they think they see something, or there's a mismatch between what they were expecting and what actually happens. Maybe they're in a bathroom and somebody knocks on the door and they say, oh, just a minute. And then they open the door and nobody's there. It's a little, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. Those are things that have happened to people. They might not even be scary depending on the situation that you're in. I think level 1 is about how you play things, like the other like mood and vibe and tension that you've created. And lightening it up with romance or humor is a great way to make it so that people who are maybe a little scared of reading horror find it to be a more like reader-friendly experience, one that they're willing to dip their toe into.
Maybe I will read level 1. Maybe. You've maybe convinced me. I'll see how I feel about it, Let's jump into level 2. So level 2 is visceral and suspenseful, grounded in reality instead of the unknown fears, while adding supernatural elements. Would the series Supernatural be considered a level 2?
I think it's episode dependent, because some of them are pretty campy and others are like, I don't know, that one might be a little spookier. It can depend like on phobias that you have. A lot of that might be stuff that is on the table for like Supernatural, because it's such a broad show. It was on for so many years. But yeah, I think that you could get to level 2 very easily.
Have you ever seen the series Ghost Whisperer?
Was that the one with Jennifer Love Hewitt?
Yes.
Yes. Uh-huh.
So would that be kind of considered a level 2 because it has the supernatural elements of spirits and ghosts and stuff?
I feel like that one to me is less of a level 2, because that one sort of oftentimes did the thing where it brought the viewer back to that sense of safety by the end of the episode. Obviously, some of the elements could be spookier, but there's a lot to be done with like when you see a ghost, right? For example, either in a show or a movie or on the page in a book, there are lots of different ways that you can describe it or dress it up or use special effects to make it look extra scary, or less scary. And so there's like the baseline idea of seeing a ghost, and then there's all of these toppings that you can layer on top of it. You know, people can make it look horrifying, and then I think so you end up being like, I'm scared of the scary thing I'm seeing as well as the idea of seeing a ghost. Like, I don't, you may not have seen the movie like The Ring, but you might be familiar with it.
Is it the thing where the person comes out of the TV?
That's scary, right? The body's not moving the way it's supposed to, and the makeup that's on it looks kind of horrifying. And there's also an uncanny valley of like, it's supposed to be human, but it doesn't behave in human-like ways or doesn't look human-like. Those things easily start bumping up into level 2, level 3 when you know, there's a lot of kind of buttons you can push to get there.
I love how you pulled out the difference between elements and horror level, because I feel like you could have Casper the Friendly Ghost, where even the bad guy ghosts are, in a sense, not scary. But then you have things like Beetlejuice, where this is weird and crazy, and they're doing everything that they can to make it look scary.
Yes. I mean, exactly. If you think like zombies, right? So zombies are big. People love them. There's The Last of Us. I read The Girl with All the Gifts, and I loved that. And that's like very zombie focused. But then there are things like Goosebumps, you know, like a big, broad genre of like horror novels for middle grade. And they cover all sorts of, you know, it'd be like Zombies Ate My Teacher, like, and there's Bailey School Kids, I think, that also have like horror elements mixed in for middle grade. And again, it's about the treatment that you do. It can, like, Frankenstein can be terrifying, or Frankenstein can be kind of the goofy kid that comes to your class and frustrates your teacher. Like, you have so much that you can play with.
That makes me think of Wednesday. Because when I grew up, I watched the cartoon one and I was like, oh, this is fun, this is cute, this is sweet. And now I watch the Netflix one and I'm like, what the hide?
Yes. I think the gross out part, there's an element where it's like, I think you were talking about like visceral and suspenseful. So there's the suspense, but that visceralness, that being grossed out, the zombie thing that I don't like, that can be a big element of horror. And some people are all about it, and body horror and all of that. And some people are, you know, like me, a little squeamish.
I feel like Wednesday, the new Wednesday, toes that line between the visceral and into the level 3 where it gets psychological. So level 3 is psychological and preys on unknowns or unknowables, the subversive, the disturbing, and the bizarre.
Yeah. To me, it feels like there's a real thread between sort of like the Wednesday for like Netflix and like American Horror Story and like the Mike Flanagan productions for Netflix, like you know, Haunting of Hill House and Bly Manor and Midnight Mass and all of those things. They feel sort of in conversation with each other. A lot of it feels suspenseful, and then it tips into maybe like the visceral and disturbing, and then there's a supernatural element that can be quite unsettling. And I think they're all sort of playing at different, like with the same instruments at different intensities. There's this great book by Elma Katsu called The Hunger, and it's a reimagination of like the historical event that happened with the Donner Party. And so you're taking something that's already, that facts are kind of unsettling, and I think would fall into like a true history with unsettling elements. But then she brings in like supernatural elements, but also sort of ramps up the you know, the characteristics of the historical figures to be more unsettling, to have more horror elements, to be darker, and uses those as like a psychological examination of humanity, but also like through the lens of what does it mean to be like cannibalism. And I think then it becomes much more about being able to use that lens to look around at like the different ways that humans can hurt each other. Why do you find one element of it so disturbing when you don't necessarily bring that same sense of horror to the ways that humans really are hurting each other all the time?
Never heard of it. But you know, that's very interesting. Okay, so then we'll go into level 4. So level 4 will be described as the truly menacing, straight up unsettling, and with serious content warnings. So what would you consider content warnings being?
Obviously, there will be some overlap in general, but content warnings for horror might be like that they specifically are engaging with elements that they know are phobias that people have. Like, think of like Stephen King's It. Prominently features a clown, prominently features child endangerment or child abuse or sexual assault, though that's not super common in horror these days, that last one. But so there'll be body horror is often one that you'll find. Perhaps there'll be things like insects or dead bodies, depending on how specific the trigger warnings are laid out. And again, even if they're not laid out in the books themselves, because that tends to be kind of a divisive topic. Often you can go right on Reddit. You can find those for yourself. Take care of yourself as a reader. If you know there's something out there that it's just not for you, like definitely do your research.
Does this kind of also move into the more gore sort of elements into horror, where there's going to be like more visually disturbing images, bring in those more unsettling, straight up like, wow, that monster is a horrible thing?
There will definitely be more on page or more on screen elements of things that, like, body horror is a very specific thing, but there also is like horrifying stuff that can happen to people's bodies or animals' bodies or monsters' bodies that will be over there. There may also just be the more monstrous itself, whether that's like a straight up monster or whether that's humans treating each other in like fairly monstrous ways, that kind of thing. There are elements of that even in books that aren't horror or books at the previous levels, and it has to do with how you treat it. You know, we try to give general content warnings at the beginning of any of our sections that might be upsetting. And so we just try to be careful of things. You know, I had a beta reader who was very kind and wanted to beta read one of the Gothic horror novel that I wrote, but she was pregnant at the time. While there was nothing graphic in my book that was about like childbirth or, you know, child death, there were mentions of it. Part of the novel takes place in from the 1840s to the 1860s, and that was a common thing that did happen back then, and it was part of the psychological underpinnings of the story. It wasn't, you know, played for horror on the page, but I definitely checked in with her ahead of time to make sure that that was all right. We're here to tell stories. We're here to have fun. Horror is one of those things where it feels like, yes, it's also a social commentary, and it can also be meant to terrify because people love to be scared in safe ways. You know, usually it just becomes a thing of showing up to the page with the correct expectations. Then you have a better experience, and it's kind of what the author wants too, I think, at least for me as author. Like, I want the reader to have a great experience.
I also feel like you could have something that is gory, that is lightly glazed over, like they walk into the room and they see the red and then they close their eyes and turn away or whatever, and so it never really comes on page, versus the deeper description of it and what it looks like and everything.
Yeah, you know how like there's in romance novels, there's like fade to black romance. You know, there's almost like fade to black horror where we're not spending time on the page, like, you know, really lingering here, kind of a thing.
So let's get into the level 5, and they talk about this like a Carolina Reaper sort of level of horror. I love that they called it Carolina Reaper. But this is what they described as genuine terror. Things that can only go from bad to worse, offering the worst of the imagination of the human mind and things beyond ourselves.
That to me is very accurate in terms of description. And I think it's one where content warnings can become even more important, or just opting in or out depending on what you know to be your personal tolerance. And I find, though, that it's also one that's very personal. What brings a 4 to a 5 for you can be very different than what brings a 3 or a 4 to a 5 for another person. And I think a lot of people would think of, say, like Stephen King books as like some of the most, you know, well-known horror novels, and they automatically assume that those are going to be 5s, when that's not the case at all. Honestly, there's a lot of variation in like Stephen King books, and then there are some people who read them and they're like, they're really not that scary. They're more tense, or they're eerie, or they're unsettling. People might find it really scary because it speaks to like childhood fears and like feeling very vulnerable and like not protected by the adults in your life. Whereas some people might find like Pet Sematary to be very scary for them, like level 5, because it deals with child death and animal death and loss of control and loss of normalcy from those that we love. Some things that are like really fundamentally can be terrifying. I find that that's the one where it's almost like you sort of have to decide what for you is the thing that's really going to push it into that level 5. Some people think of it like the difference between reading like a level 5 chili pepper spicy romance novel and then tipping over into erotica, and that level 5 horror might be more like erotica. But I think especially these days, that's less and less true. The horror writers are so smart and they're just doing such fun things. And I honestly think that about every genre, but I'm pleased that horror is getting like a resurgence of attention, because it gives like way more latitude for all sorts of voices to get in there that we haven't heard from before, in all kinds of ways. Even in like graphic novel, there's been some wonderful horror graphic novels that come out recently. I think it's called Infidel, and it's by like Pornsak Pinshetsote, and it was named like one of NPR's 100 greatest like horror books of all time. And it's kind of like a take on a haunted house, but it's like a Muslim woman and her neighbors, they move into a building where there are sort of like these creatures that feed off of xenophobia. It's scary, it's smart, it's so well done, it's so timely. I just think that it's like there's a lot of fun stuff coming out of horror.
I do have a question though. We mentioned like level 2 is when they start implementing like supernatural elements, but does it mean that if you write a level 5 horror that it has to have supernatural elements to it?
No, not at all. There's like a movie with Matthew McConaughey. It was sort of like fathers and sons, and there was some sort of really messed up relationship between the fathers and sons across like the years, and there was definitely elements of child abuse in it and stuff like that. But that was one of the very like most like deeply unsettling movies, and I don't remember it having any sort of supernatural element in it. Again, we're back to this idea of like the horrible things humans are perfectly capable of doing to each other, but it was done with such a suspenseful, point of view that it felt like you're starting in suspense, and then it became more like, oh no, something really bad is going to happen. It's that, oh no, something really bad is going to happen, that I think moves something from like suspense and mystery into horror.
You've mentioned Stephen King a couple of times, and this quote from him is one that I feel like really sums up that entire point, where he said, "It is not the physical or mental aberration in itself that horrifies us, but the lack of order with which aberrations seem to imply." And so if you're implying more versus implying less, you're going to grow or shrink that level of horror that people get from the idea itself.
Yeah, I think that says a lot. We're back to the knock on the bathroom door. You like in and of itself not horrifying, but like what is the lack of order that you can then follow the steps from that too? Again, it's like you come out, it's sunshiny, it's daytime, your kids are there, maybe it was a cat noise, all kinds of things, right? Not horrifying at all. And then but every time you add something that knocks it a little further out of expectation, a little further out of order, it's like, what does that next thing you're worried about imply about vulnerability, lack of control, like, your sense of autonomy, these things that are really important to our feelings of well-being in the world. And I think people like to see on page how people deal with that and face it in brave ways, in angry ways, in upsetting ways. And then like, how do you then reintegrate into the like society at the end, or well-being, or how do you come to any sort of conclusion about those things? It can be really satisfying to trace those sorts of character arcs.
What I have learned from this whole conversation is that know your own horror level maximum and minimum, and then do go read reviews to kind of figure out, okay, this might be for me or this might not be for me, which I think is very similar to your romance spice levels. Though I do wonder, because I know when a lot of book reviewers review romance novels, they would put spicy levels. Do people do that for like horror though? Like, I don't think they have like a rating for that, do they?
There's definitely no formal rating, but the place where you would see it show up most often would probably be in marketing materials on that author's social media, stuff like that, any sort of infographics. And you don't see it as often, but you will see people taking it and lumping it together with other books. This is really like, I think where comps and comparable reading experiences come into play. They'll be like, it's a lot like reading these other folk horrors or like these other feminist horrors and things like that. So even if a book isn't out yet or it's new and there aren't a lot of reviews for it yet, but you really want to read it, you can think, oh, well, it's comparable to these others in the genre. And then you can find out if you like, maybe you've read those or maybe you can find reviews on those to give yourself some footing.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you so much for coming and talking with us, Mattea, because I really feel like people need to understand how to make their novels the level of horror that they intentionally want to make them. And this discussion has just unfolded all of that how-to for me.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun, and I hope that you have fun incorporating elements into your dark fantasy, and I can't wait to read that. And Nell, I hope that maybe you dip a toe in somewhere, something a little spooky this spooky season.
Listen, I think my limit is Goosebumps, like the middle grade. I'm like, I'll go for that one. It was really, really so nice talking to you and learning so much because I really do not know much about horror. I think people who might want to dip their toe into horror will find this very helpful.
If you'd like to learn more from Mattea and to see what else she's up to in the publishing world, you can find her at www.matteaorr.com or at linktr.ee/Mattea Orr, and those links will also be in the show notes.
Thank you again. This has been absolutely so fun.
We like to keep things short here on Tea and Tales. Get your fingers back on the keyboard and your pens back on paper.
If you enjoy what we are doing here, you like the topics that we are discussing, and you love the guests that we have on, go follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads at Tea and Tales Podcast, and on Twitter/X and TikTok at Podcast Details. And go to that purple icon on your device and go give us 5 stars so that you can help us go up, up, up. It's our moment.
Happy writing.
Bye.